Between the years of 1662 and 1804, 3.1 million Africans were transported in the transatlantic slave trade through the Atlantic Ocean. There were various reasons why African slavery began in the Caribbean. One of the major ones is the trade of sugarcane grown in the Caribbean. There were various unsuccessful attempts in growing sugarcane in the Caribbean, which was then overcome by flourish days. Sugarcane was very important for trade as it could be used for different products like tea, coffee, and chocolate. It was also used to make rum. With time, the demand for sugarcane increased enormously among Europeans, and so the Caribbean colonies became more valuable economically. For the cultivation of sugarcane, laborers were needed to grow, plant cane, manure, weed, and harvest. The introduction of sugar cultivation began in the 1640s. The slaves were quite economical. In the 1650, an African slave costed 7 pounds, and in 1690 the price rose to 17 to 22 pounds. A white laborer in comparison in the same century costed 10 pounds only for a few years, which did not include their food, shelter, clothing, which costed the same amount as a laborer. The Europeans also believed that Africans were more suited to the harsh climate of Caribbean, as it was similar to climate in West Africa. Thus, African slaves could work effectively in the unpleasant conditions of humidity and heat. Another reason for the beginning of slavery in Caribbean was the increasing population of black men in the late 17th century. In the start of 1650s, Africans formed only 20% of the population. By 1678, the population rose to 3,849, where whites were only 3,521. In the start of 18th century, the Africans rose to 80% of the population. The Europeans became threatened from this rise of African population. Thus, the treatment of Africans by Europeans became harsher, and in order to prevent a rebellion in the future, the Europeans believed converting Africans into slaves was the best incentive for Europeans, both economically and politically.
Could you give some information about the slavery transportation process from Africa to Caribbean?
Of course, the slaves used in Caribbean sugar plantation were transported from Africa to the New World in the Middle Passage. Middle Passage was the one of the state of the triangle trade. Europeans took the millions of slaves and transported them to the Caribbean for sugar plantation. Then the crops were transported to the Europe. These journeys were financed by the companies to make profit mostly. From about 1525 and 1866, approximately 12.5 million Americans were taken from their homelands and forcibly shipped to the New World across the Atlantic. Known as the Middle Passage, this sea voyage could range from 1 to 6 months depending on weather conditions. During a journey, approximately 2 million of them could not survive.
Today we have a conversation with Miss Elizabeth. She is the relative of Olayo Equiano. Hi, can you give us some information about Olayo Equiano?
We have information thanks to his letters and book. In one of his letters, he talks about the harshness of the conditions of slave transportation. The closeness of the place and the heat of the climate added to the number in the ship, which was so crowded that each had scarcely room to turn himself, almost suffocating us. This produced copious respirations, so that air soon became unfit for respiration from a variety of loathsome smells, and brought on a sickness among the slaves, of which many died, thus falling victims to the improvident affairs, as I call it, of their purchasers. This wretched situation was again aggravated by the galling of the chains. Filled of the necessary tubs, large buckets for human waste, into which the children often fell, and were almost suffocated. The shrieks of the women and the groans of the dying rendered the whole a scene of horror almost inconceivable.
Thank you.
Ships were capable of transporting hundreds of Africans in a journey. In these ships included weapons middle of it to prevent rebellions, and there were extra compartments to take more slaves or, from their understanding, human cargo. Before boarding slaves to the ship, they were stripped of their clothes, marked, and shaved their hairs. Boarding could take weeks or even months, and during the boarding, slaves lived on the ship or wooden houses were built by the crew. Also, there was a netting around the ship to catch slaves who preferred death rather than being slaves. Slaves who moved below the deck found themselves stuffed into compartments with ceilings as low as 4 feet, so they could not stand and they had to spend whole journey in that compartment. Slaves were classified according to their gender and age. Men kept separately as prisoners and they shacked in pairs. Women usually left without bonds in their compartments, and the children often free to move around the ship. There was no space to maintain their lives for men. They forced to live where they sat, and the conditions were not livable because of the heat and the oxygen shortage. For these reasons, diseases such as smallpox and the influenza spread drastically between slaves. Disease ravaged both slaves and the crew members. Slaves spent almost 8 hours per day above deck, but they were still separated by gender with a barricado, and there was a wall to protect crew in a case of a revolt. Moreover, slaves were forced to exercise, including dance and the song for entertainment of the crew members. Disobedience means torturing and the beating with a tool, which designed for maximum pain. And the slaves who rejected eating typical meal of rice and the beans were forced to open their mouths, which tool is called speculomoris. Women were raped and sexually abused by a member of crew. They sometimes arrived the New World carrying the children of their attackers. Owners of companies argued that killing the sick animals is legal, so it was legal to kill infected slaves. That's why slaves were not seen as humans, so it was the most cruelty of the history.
Can you give us some information about the end of slavery?
Yes, of course. During the 300 years of its existence, the transatlantic slave trade brought an estimated 6.5 million enlistments Africans to the Caribbean. This journey to the Caribbean and other parts of the New World is known as the Middle Passage. Africans were forcibly brought to British-owned colonies in the Caribbean and sold as slaves to work on plantation. The abolition of slavery was slow, gradual and enduring process throughout the Caribbean. In the 19th century, however, various political, economic, social and humanitarian factors come together to forge the way for the disappearance of slavery. Various theories have explained abolition from perspectives ranging from humanitarian to economic. According to one theory from Eric Williams about capitalism and slavery, the low profitability on the slave system on sugar plantations in the British Caribbean in the early 19th century was the main reason that the slave trade disappeared and that slavery was eventually abolished. Apart from theories, the abolitionist movements in Britain and France, the decline in sugar plantation in the Antilles, and the constant slavery was influenced abolition of slavery. Also, association with like a Caribbean terrorist society for the Methodian played an important role. For example, this organization lobbied to improve the living and working conditions of the slaves through creation of laws and reforms, and some of the measures such as slaves were allowed to present testimony in local courts. Also, slaves were allowed to own property. Slaves were given to 1 day 2 week arrest. Although these measures were passed with the goal of easing the hardship and cruelty of the slaves' lives, they were not welcome in the colonies. The colonial legislators strongly blocked implication of measures and slaves continued to survive in the same employment conditions. In the third decade of the 18th century, the increased petitions and pressure on the parliament, along with the decline in sugar trade and the constant slavery wars, had an effective role in abolishment of slavery. The British slave trade officially ended in 1807, but its effects continued until the year approximately 1838. On the one hand, the abolition of slavery does not discharge them from all kinds of labor and from the performance of work and duties to those who are their employers. On the other hand, even after the end of slavery and apprenticeships, the Caribbean was not totally free. Former enslaved people received no compensation and had limited representation in the legislatures. Thank you.
No break. Work.
What do you think about the relationship between slavery and capitalism? To understand the idea of slavery, first of all, we should understand capitalism. What is capitalism and why it exists? Capitalism basically an economic system, and it is dominant in the Western world since the breakup of feudalism, in which most of the means of production are privately owned and production is guided and income distributed largely through the operation of markets. In this economic system, capital goods, natural resources, and labor have a great importance, and the main idea is profit maximization. Moreover, during the centuries, people were dependent on natural resources and labor because there was not enough industrial development. That's why slavery and colonialism emerged all around the world. Especially Caribbean slavery, characterized by savage methods of forced labor and primitive tools, was designed to raise industrial and food crops for export, such as sugarcane, tobacco, coffee, cacao, rice, indigo, and cotton. It was begun with Portuguese, and after that there were both French and British colonization. They all used both native people and the land to make more profits. Because of this slavery and colonization, many African states stay underdeveloped today. They had no chance to enhance their economy due to exploitation of Western countries in terms of both labor and natural resources. Caribbean slavery system was especially important for many Western countries because it was the core of almost all economic life, actually. Europeans' intensive exploitation resulted in destruction of the whole Caribbean islands. Almost all of the forests destroyed due to agriculture of sugarcane in particular. Although some of the countries still has capitalist ideas, there is no such idea to make people slave, at least directly. And I want to finish my speech by sharing a poem with you to make everything clear. In bags suspended from their deep gold necks, of helpless babes the suppurated load, and feeble mothers bear, some big with child, the cries of famine, grief, fatigue, despair, with those of parturition, void of hope, in melancholy symphony conjoin, no husbands near to minister souls, or make the agonizing mother dim. Thank you.